Hi, everyone.
Hello, hello.
All right. Um, I think we have critical mass here of people. Excited to see so many people joining. Thanks for joining us. Um, we're here to talk about some of the trends that we're seeing in generative AI applications and use cases. We're from DataRobot, so we take a very applied AI approach. So we want to talk a lot about what does this mean for the different use cases that are possible. What are the practical concerns with realizing value, and what to think about in terms of future proofing to protect your companies, your businesses, your use cases to continue to realize value from all these different new applications and use cases that are now possible. So my name is Michael Schmitz. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at DataRobot, and I'm joined by two of our GenAI experts and leads here. So we have Yuanbo Wang, Principal Deep Learning Engineer, and we have Alex Conway, the Principal Software Engineer on our GenAI and Innovation team inside of DataRobot. And they'll be also jumping in to kind of speak and talk to some of the trends and what they mean in real life for GenAI use cases. So if you've never heard of DataRobot before, a really brief introduction is we are an AI platform really focused on three big things. One is operating custom or DataRobot models, pipelines, blueprints, running them, deploying them, comparing them, experimenting, all that type of stuff. Governance of those models, so think of version tracking, approval process flows, auditing, compliance documentation generation, all those things needed for various industries and applications of AI. And then finally, building, right? So organizing, experimenting, tuning. And we do all of this for both generative and predictive AI use cases. We try to provide an experience that is end-to-end. It's completely flexible for custom tools you might already be using, augmenting existing processes, or building end-to-end very quickly with the best tools available. And we have deep partnerships with all the major model providers, cloud compute providers, as well as on-prem offerings and things like that. So that's the brief intro to DataRobot. So let's get on with what we really came here to talk about, which is what's happening in GenAI. So we've broken this discussion into these five main areas. So the first one is, how do we see GenAI use cases evolving over the next year, basically kind of what we've learned over 2023? What are some of the new model capabilities and technologies that are changing things? What does that mean for the stack, for use cases that are possible, use cases that will be able to realize value that maybe they weren't before, things like that? What are some of the important governance, operational, cost pressures, how we see those potentially playing out this year and to be aware of for your businesses? Second to last year on serving GenAI use cases, what we think is going to be the most important for serving, operating, hosting GenAI use cases for the next year. And then finally, a more fun one is really around hype and kind of our take on what we think is hype, what's not, what we think is changing, maybe not changing in this kind of crazy world we're living in here with GenAI. So with that, let's jump into the first one. So one of the major first trends we see here with GenAI use cases in general is just the idea of the use cases, particularly RAG-based use cases, continue to get more and more sophisticated. This is also closely tied to the different technologies that are available. So this is one view into what relatively modern GenAI retrieval augmented generation search application looks like. And this is actually inspired by some earlier stack diagrams you might have seen out there. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. We're just trying to clarify, where we think things kind of sit in terms of the stack. So on the top left here, you can see what does the builder really need to go bring? They need to bring grounding contextual data, your proprietary data to be able to answer specific questions about your business, products, internal documents, things like this. Often you also will bring some sort of assessment data. This could also be human feedback data, but other people are building this manually. That's important for that experimentation, actually build something that you can test and then trust. So a lot of things we do in DataRobot is trying to help facilitate that. And then finally, the builder has to bring this use case framing, right? So what are the actual requirements of the use case? And this goes into this experimentation process. The experimentation typically defines what is your grounding strategy for your generation, and what's your generation strategy? And these are different techniques, combinations of techniques. These are constantly evolving to be able to do more and more things with your data and with generations. And these interact very closely with governance and access control. So as you're doing both the experimentation, but also updating models, replacing components, changing all of this, having access to the right data and surfacing that to people that have access. Ultimately, this gets fed into an LLM. So think of an LLM provider, OpenAI, Azure, Hugging Face, open source models. We work a lot with people that are using AWS or GCP to kind of serve models as well. Very important, that feeds into a monitoring observability part of the stack. And finally, this gets to an application where it can start to impact your users, right? So now that you have user queries coming in, you have outputs, and then really importantly, we'll talk about this a little bit, you'll have feedback coming in as well. This feedback is really important because it loops back into closing the loop to actually improve results over time. It becomes invaluable proprietary data for your business, for your use cases, which we'll talk about a little bit more. We don't have time to get into it here, but all these parts of the stack also break into multiple different components, right? So there's playgrounds for doing experimentation. There's experiment tracking and comparison, analytics, insights, assessment modeling that you can do with all this feedback data. Grounding data obviously has vector databases, plugins, other ways to kind of source external info. And all these things kind of go into serving modern use cases. And this is just part of a bigger trend of how these GenAI use cases are maturing and also becoming a bit more sophisticated for real use cases, especially as people scale them up and want to unleash more of these use cases inside their businesses and their enterprises. One last thing I'll say here, this is probably not again, is with GenAI, we just see an order of magnitude more use cases in companies. So when I go talk to companies, a lot of them are doing 10, 20, or 30 kind of simultaneous POVs of GenAI use cases internally. And that's at least an order of magnitude of what people might be doing with traditional predictive or forecasting models. I think it's just easier to do these. There's a lot of greenfield. Of course, it's probably part of the reason here, but there's just a higher surface area to go do things. And that's what makes having a well-defined stack for this experimentation and production process really important. If you want to expose this to more and more users, consumers, and stakeholders internally, particularly this governance layer becomes very important, and the observability becomes really important as well to allow kind of more organic experimentation and use throughout the organization. So these are two areas that we try to focus on at DataRobot that can be useful and helpful as well. So let's dig into a few more trends based upon some of this. So like I said, things are getting more complicated, more sophisticated for serving these things, particularly around RAG type of strategies. Another important thing is just assessment data is going to continue to grow, and the use of, in particular, synthetic assessment data. So many different use cases don't actually come in with a ton of labeled data. It's not really a great process that most companies have to go build or even contract out creating labeled data. But there's many techniques you can use to synthetically torture test your generative AI models to have some level of confidence in how they'll behave and perform to answer questions based upon your company's kind of contextual data that you're bringing. So the proprietary data that's powering your vector database or your grounding strategy. We're seeing this more and more. It's very useful for sussing out what your system can answer and how well it can actually surface information for relevant answers to questions you want to go do. And there's various different synthetic strategies to kind of elaborate and kind of expand on the type of testing that's possible. A third trend here that we see is just more and more focus on the grounding data quality, right? So we're used to having data prep being very important for machine learning in general. Many fewer people are really paying close attention yet to the actual grounding data that's being used. But it's equally important. It's as important as the data that's used to train the LLMs. It's as important for any type of data that you might be using. And if you have incorrect or missing information in that grounding data, you'll generate bad answers. It'll be out of date or won't be able to answer at all. So an example here on the right, this is actually an internal use case that we have inside DataRobot. We have a few different tools that we use for answering questions, things like this. In this example, the person who created this RAG pipeline, they just pulled in all of our documentation repo. It's mostly markdown files, but also has things like styling sheets, HTML, vector graphics. These are all text files as well. And without knowing it, you could easily accidentally start pulling in HTML tags or other junk to pollute the answers of your system. And unless you have some observability into your grounding data, you won't be able to even realize kind of what's in there or how that might be impacting negative feedback results, poor quality answers, or even hallucinations and stuff like that. In fact, focusing on quality of the grounding data is probably your number one lever that we're seeing to really improve the quality of outputs for generating strategies. Let's move on to a second category of different trends that we're seeing. So this is more specifically around capabilities of the large language models themselves and the generative strategies that are out there. So, there's definitely going to be this kind of continued sort of rapid progress, new capabilities that are being added there. So what do we think is actually maybe important to be aware of? So number one, as a broader trend that we're seeing is that the large language models themselves are starting to absorb more of the GenAI tooling that's out there. So in the past, you'd have to create tooling and pipelines for translating different document types or images to text so you could actually work with them semantically in meaningful ways. These are now being done automatically. Even parts of like RAG or things you might be doing with agents, harnesses to kind of call models in different patterns and ways to get better results. These are also now starting to be natively integrated into the providers and to the models themselves in some cases as a general trend. And the reason why this is important is that you might be building GenAI use cases in-house. And the important part there is that the techniques or the best components are going to be changing radically as quickly as the models are changing as well, right? And what they can kind of do. And it's very important to think about what is the long-term maintainability strategy? How are you going to go about planning ahead to go replace parts, eliminate parts of the pipeline that are no longer necessary in order to kind of make these systems high quality into the future as well.
Yeah, so I want to add a little bit on there as well. So like as the general model providers get better and better, for example, context window was something that it was a major limitation before. So a lot of the LM developers, they are just like hacking around to make the context window longer. But then when GPT-4 came out, and then they can incorporate much longer context window, so a lot of the previous work kind of went to obsolete. So like another way of thinking, okay, as the general providers get better, how can we stay still ahead of the game? So like kind of thinking backward is another way I like to see this. For example, customization is a big thing if you're dealing with custom like enterprise level application. Like your data is your asset. Like OpenAI and all these general providers, they're not going to have access and do customization on top of your, LM application. And then, so that kind of ties back to the previous point that Michael was talking about. Like your data is very important. How to curate the data set, making sure that it's good quality. How do you kind of tie your data back to your application? It's another very important area that will probably not go away, no matter how good the foundational models get.
100%. And also, we got a comment earlier from Nadia on the architecture slide, and it's somewhat relevant here, where she said that she sees governance, kind of comes in at the beginning, especially when you're bringing in that data, and make sure that clearing with your privacy and legal teams internally that you have the appropriate consent and approval that for the use of the data that you're going to be building into your application. I think it's going to be a little bit of a shift, because we're now starting to use new kinds of data in ways that we haven't used before. So the governance aspect of it, as well as the quality, cleaning, contextualization of it, those are all going to shift and become new challenges that we haven't really addressed before. So it's really important to pay attention to the governance aspects. Thank you, Nadia, as well as these quality and context issues.
Yeah, the risk profile for text generation is very different than like a probabilistic prediction or a forecast, right? Because now you can start to surface different data directly in the output. It's a little bit different. And then the other point I was going to add on to what Alex and Juan were just already talking about was, there's a lot going on in terms of different model strategies and architectures. State space models are being discussed and explored quite a bit right now. This could completely change what's possible in terms of how you use context, having virtually unlimited context potentially in certain ways. We don't know exactly how that will play out in practice, but it's something that could impact a lot of the strategies that end up being the most relevant, a year from now. So maintaining flexibility is probably the biggest takeaway there. Just a couple of the really quick points here of trends is, you might have tried doing function calling before, maybe even with like OpenAI's GPTs, you can kind of configure actions and function calling. In the past, this really hasn't been really robust. Even today, it's not that great an experience, but I think it's going to be much more powerful. And this will open up whole new doors to entirely new use cases, where now you can go much further in terms of taking actions, having the chatbot automate certain processes, either conversationally or purely through process automation and things like that. So this will kind of expand the use cases that are possible as the models get better at understanding which functions are relevant to call and actually how to fill in the parameters for them, especially for more complicated or more complex function calling you might want to do, right, depending on the context. And then multimodal is one we already touched on before. Most providers are investing heavily in just ingesting and outputting multiple different formats, not just images plus text, but also specific document types and parsing those in different ways and more useful ways. So more and more, that's just going to be easier and easier to do. Maybe not all use cases are going to use multimodal, but it will definitely open up the doors to potentially very high impact use cases, even if they're less frequent. Moving on. So the next one category of kind of major GenAI trends that we see here is focus on management and sort of cost pressures, right? So one big consideration that we see, we talked about this before, we see companies that are doing dozens of simultaneous like POVs of GenAI use cases, just a high volume of these. We see this internally in DataRobot as well, just with our internal assistants that we've created for different processes. It's not always clear what bots are available, which bot to answer what question for, and maintaining lots of these different bots simultaneously is kind of redundant and time consuming to do. And we see this as a major challenge, is having proper observability, manageability, and scalability of the different use cases that you want to employ internally or externally. And this might drive some more consolidation, right? You might have 20 different internal use cases one of the things that we're looking into DataRobot is helping kind of consolidate those so you can actually easily manage and then have your consumers find and use them more effectively.
I'd just like to tie that to one of the questions that we got, which is if you're using external or synthetic data, how do you address the data lineage question when your application is getting audited and reviewed? And this ties into bot proliferation from the sense that like there's going to be a lot of different use cases, a lot of different data flowing into your applications as well. So one thing is to try to build or buy a centralized system of record for everything that you're doing so that you can kind of always go back and see. That's important for auditing as well as simple quality control and debugging. But one lesson that I've just learned working with LLMs in general is try to save essentially everything that's going in and out of your models. Try to have very full records, whatever platform or tools you're using. This stuff is very valuable. It can be very expensive to regenerate, and it can be very important to know and be able to go and look up like what was actually in the context that was sent to this application, or what was the version of files that I was using when I was building this knowledge base.
Yeah, a huge part of governance and regulation, reporting, compliance, things like this is just documenting what was done, right? What data was used, and how was it connected to the system? What does that history look like? So that's something we're focused a lot on trying to make that easier.
Yeah, and then another thing is that like synthetic data can come in many different formats. Like synthetically generated questions to interact with your knowledge base. That could be very useful when it comes to this skill gap. For example, your developers who's making the RAG probably doesn't know much about the type of documents you are using. It's not necessarily the expert for that special area. Like the developer knows how to build a RAG and not knows how to evaluate LM, but that's about it. So synthetically generated questions can help your developers interact with the knowledge base and develop that intuition for your specific area that you're interested in building the chatbot in. So that's why like we're not saying synthetic data is gonna get away with everything. Like you still need human in the loop, but it really helps to bridge the gap between someone who's building the app versus like the business unit holder, or things like that.
The next trend I wanted to talk about here is really around cost pressures and some of the trends that are happening with smaller models and some of these more smaller open source models that are available now. One of the surprising things we've seen over the past mostly 6 months is how powerful some of these smaller models actually perform in different use cases. So if you look back into the summer, there's just a huge difference in terms of what was actually possible, the quality available from using like a 7 billion parameter model to GPT 3.5 or 4 or something like that. But for RAG use cases, not all RAG use cases, but for a lot of them, that gap has shrunk enormously. So this on the right here is one example for one particular use case. Again, this isn't true for every single use case, but many. Doing RAG with a smaller model can actually be quite effective. So here you can actually compare the output, like how grounded is it, GB4, and still like the most grounded model. It's going to use the context most effectively. But the other ones do decently well. And if you compare to that sort of gold standard answer, even a model that's like 13 billion parameters is 80% as good, right? Or similar in terms of the output or quality output. But the real surprising thing is if you look at, in this case, this had like labeled ground truth data, was reviewed by human experts, what's the desired response and the similarity to the desired response, there's almost no distinguishable difference between these, right? They're within a few percent. And some of these models can perform really well. They need to be able to translate basically the context to answer the question. And sometimes you need a very sophisticated model to handle that context and the questions, but a lot of use cases can do quite well with some of these smaller open source models. And that gives at least one avenue towards alleviating some cost pressures that some of these use cases potentially become more successful and scale up and have higher volume, et cetera. A fourth one here, maybe just one last point here is to, again, double down on thinking ahead, need for flexibility. The best model for your use case with the best cost profile today might be wildly different in 3, 4, 5, or 6 months into the next year. So thinking ahead of how we're going to maintain and swap out different components in a safe way and do that is something that you should plan for now, given how dynamic the space is. And then finally, here's we see a lot of regulations happening. It's worthwhile thinking ahead to not get boxed into those, right? We see, even if they're not coming into effect for another like year or two, be aware of what is the governance angle of things that might block you, or you might be, having to come back and re-document everything you've done in order to kind of pass muster, right, when these regulations do come into effect. So think about the governance and observability now, right, for new use cases. All right, so next category of trends here is around deployments and operation. And I'll go quickly because I know some people need to drop at the half-hour mark. So big thing is this use case environments are going to broaden. So a lot of development is happening in cloud, but a lot of people want to go deploy these things on premise and things like that. I think we're going to see more and more of that, especially as people want to go use more sensitive data, right? And data that's, or pipelines that are closer to the data they actually want to go use and not to kind of take off premise. And this could open up new use cases to kind of go do that. Use that to data that's not really readily usable today. Probably the most important trend here, however, is number 2. We should put this as number 1. Is really the feedback capture. We think we talked about this at the start. If you're not doing feedback capture today, highly encourage you to go take the time to go build this into every use case you're doing. That feedback that you can use is invaluable, right? It gives you a strategic advantage for how you go to improve that use cases, how you differentiate from your competitors. They're also trying to do all these GenAI use cases. That feedback data will be useful for testing your models, improving the results, assessing them. You can build assessment models from the feedback. There's the return on that is huge. It's one of the reasons why we prioritize feedback capture inside of DataRobot for GenAI from the very start, is that you can use this in just so many ways to understand how people are using your systems and your data, catch problems in real time, and avoid major issues. You can see an example here of some of our usage data for one of our internal bots you have. And you can see in your vector database what parts of your context data are implicated in negative feedback versus positive feedback. Maybe data is out of date, right? Where are there gaps in your knowledge base? So the things you can do this are just really, really broad and practical. And then the third trend here that we see with a lot of companies I talk to is really the need for very custom moderation of the outputs. So model providers are doing great work to avoid like toxic outputs. I don't think anyone really needs to worry about really toxic outputs for kind of leading provider models. But most use cases, practically enterprise use cases, have important requirements of things that they should or shouldn't talk about, different styles or ways they should respond or behave to answer questions fully or correctly and things like this. And the need for having the right safeguards and rules for that becomes really important. And we're not seeing these really well met by model providers themselves. So the ability to kind of go build, use, monitor, and leverage these custom rules becomes really important. It's one of the things you can do in DataRobot as well, is have a very custom moderation. Yeah, go ahead.
One important thing to note about moderation is that you cannot expect a model itself to moderate itself. You should always be looking for external solutions, even if it is a separate, involving a separate LLM or other machine learning model. You should be looking at external moderation systems, not looking to say prompt the model until it can't, quote unquote, can't say something that you don't want it to, because those are always defeatable and will always have more edge cases than an external monitoring solution.
Yeah, it's you might think you can avoid bad outputs by a system prompt that says, don't be toxic. It doesn't work, right? It's very easily either accidentally broken or intentionally broken. There's attacks of doing these things. So having actually hard, guaranteed checks in place is invaluable. It's part of the reason why we call this the confidence gap. A lot of customers or companies we talk to, they built a lot of internal use cases, but they actually haven't felt comfortable putting them into production because they actually don't trust the output enough. This is one of the key ways you can go put hard rules in to go trust and have more confidence to put something into production. All right, and finally, we get to the last part here. Thanks for staying with us for so far. I know people probably need to drop here. But what are some of the things we think are hype or not hype in this GenAI space? So one is actually a contradiction of what we talked about earlier, right? That there's huge potential and new capabilities coming out for multimodal applications, but text-to-text is still going to dominate the most use cases that people are building, especially in enterprise, just because it's much more easily available type of data. It's easier to interoperate with that type of data. And there's still a ton of greenfield use cases that are text to text. That could change quickly, but that's something just to be aware of. And even if they're smaller in volume, right, the number of multimodal use cases, those might be the really high value ones, right? And that might be just what people expect longer term. But at least still for today, we expect text to text still to be the most dominant. Second one is about prompt engineering. This is big over the past year of having these very sophisticated prompting strategies. A lot of best practices now are pretty stabilized, right? Like when I build different models or different prompting strategies, there's enough of the toolkit to kind of get what I want. Obviously, there's still work to do. It has to go into that customization through the system prompt. That's still a useful tool to do that. But it's not like we're inventing entirely new paradigms of how we go about system prompting. And there'll be more focus on other aspects of quality output, like the quality of the grounding data and how comfortable you've assessed and torture tested your pipeline to feel comfortable putting it into production, things like that. Analyzing feedback data. A lot of that is going to be higher bang for the time invested. 3 is another obvious one, I think, is that still a lot of use case development is going to be done in the cloud. The reasons why is that the top models that are available are only available in cloud. Even if you're doing on-prem things, you still want to compare against that type of model. And there's just higher flexibility to interoperate with different model types to understand and trust kind of what the performance is really like versus what's possible, what's out there. But that route to be able to go use and employ into different environments is going to be really important, like we talked about earlier. Pre-training remains rare. I would say like a year ago, a lot of DataRobot customers had like pre-training that they were doing, building model architectures from scratch, using their proprietary data if it's pre-training data. You see almost zero of that. Like several customers I've talked to have completely shut down those efforts to go focus on other areas. And there's more focus going into fine-tuning. We see more companies I'm talking to are getting better lift out of fine-tuning the embedding model, so you can kind of adapt the RAG-based lookup to be more meaningful for the company's internal language and naming and things like that and topics. A few are still doing sort of fine-tuning of the pre-trained models, but these are relatively rare. I think most people are doing customization through the grounding strategies and other things that you have to kind of get the results that you want. Vector databases, I think we're seeing more and more migration towards kind of enterprise databases that are kind of established, have all the enterprise functionality, security guarantees, things like that are really, really important. But now finally are launching GA their own vector lookups, vector indices, things like this. And a lot of these vector databases that we've been using over the past year don't necessarily have that level of kind of enterprise functionality to kind of exist there. But they still have a purpose in that they're extremely useful for rapid prototyping. And for different use cases, this can make the most sense to kind of go use and do. But we encourage you kind of, as you're building out future use cases to future-proof, consider using some of the more established kind of enterprise DBs that now have this capability. And then finally, the last point here, probably the most important point to leave you with at the end, is that LLMs still need a lot of customization to adapt to your use case. Using just a vanilla LLM off the shelf is typically not going to get you the results you want. It's not going to be moderated appropriately. It's not going to have the right style. You're not going to feel comfortable or confident in the results for the different use case, and it won't be differentiated on its own. There's lots of ways that you can go do that. There's different levers you can pull to customize, and it's also what kind of drives what makes this fun too. Is going and building the right solution with all these really powerful tools, and something that we're trying to help make it easier to do as well. Any last comments from you, Wambo or Alex, on any other topics or trends, and then we'll wrap up.
Not particularly. I just really like the customization piece. I'm looking forward to see how we can kind of scale up the common use cases and then different industries, and even within the same company, if you want to build like 20 LM applications, like how do you scale it with the amount of customization you need to put into the work to reach a good performance. So there's like that trade-off process is very exciting. So I'm looking forward to see more of that.
Yeah, and tying that into like pre-training, remaining rare, etc. I think I'm excited to see all the ways that RAG gets extended into new data sources and new retrieval techniques. And I'm excited to explore those myself.
Yeah, I see one other question here will kind of hit me before we break. It's asking about frameworks such as Llama Index, LangChain, IndexChain, these things. Yeah, these libraries for building and assembling different components and strategies is changing as rapidly as the models themselves, right? And you should think of that as like a very dynamic component to future-proof against as well. And they're making some of the code-first experience for doing that really easy, but that's also best practices there will be changing quickly as well. So adaptability of that is super important. Yeah, so let's wrap from there. Thank you for joining us for our trends and look into a discussion about what we think will be playing out, at least from our perspective, from applied AI, applied GenAI perspective over the next year. If you like this session, please join us for future sessions. We'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn as well, so feel free to reach out. And with that, have a great day. Thanks, everyone.